What if procrastination wasn't laziness, but the birthplace of creativity? Original thinkers don't wait until they're ready, because ready never comes. The world remembers their brilliance, but forgets how many bad ideas they had first. When most people hear the word procrastination, they instantly attach it to laziness, avoidance, or a lack of discipline. We are conditioned to believe that if we don't finish something early, if we're not ahead of schedule, we've somehow failed. But what if procrastination wasn't always a weakness? What if, in the hands of original thinkers, it was actually a surprising strength? Original thinkers don't procrastinate because they don't care. They procrastinate because they care deeply. They understand that rushing into a decision, forcing an idea too early, or completing a task before its time often kills creativity. Think about it. When you finish something the very moment it's assigned, what you deliver might be efficient, but it rarely carries originality. It's usually the safe answer, the predictable option, the one everyone else would have thought of too. But when you allow yourself the space to pause, when you sit in the tension of not yet having the answer, that's when your mind starts to wander, and wandering is where originality is born. The act of procrastination creates room for incubation. An idea rarely arrives fully formed in the first attempt. It needs time to breathe, to be tested, to expand beyond its initial limits. Original thinkers use procrastination not as a way to avoid responsibility, but as a strategy to let ideas collide with new inputs. They leave projects unfinished on purpose, giving their subconscious mind a chance to keep working behind the scenes. This doesn't happen when we force ourselves to finish immediately. By holding off, they give innovation a chance to enter the conversation. History is filled with examples of this pattern. Some of the most groundbreaking leaders, artists, and innovators were notorious procrastinators. They didn't deliver late because they were careless. They delivered later because they knew timing shapes ideas. Martin Luther King Jr. famously delayed finishing his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech until the night before. The reason? He wanted the message to be alive, responsive, open to the events unfolding around him. That procrastination gave space for one of the most original speeches in history to emerge. If he had written it weeks earlier and never revisited it, we might never have heard the words that still echo across generations. The same principle applies in everyday life. Think about the last time you had a problem to solve, whether at work, in school, or even in your personal life. Chances are, your first solution wasn't your best. Maybe you even felt frustrated because the answer didn't come quickly. But then you stepped away. You took a walk. You had a conversation. You slept on it. Suddenly, a better idea surfaced. That's not an accident. That's the gift of delaying, the surprising benefit of what we often label procrastination. Now, this doesn't mean original thinkers avoid action altogether. They're not paralyzed by delay, they're intentional about it. There's a difference between procrastination that is passive and procrastination that is active. Passive procrastination is ignoring the task altogether, distracting yourself endlessly, or waiting until the last second out of fear. Active procrastination, however, is purposeful. It's starting the work just enough to understand the challenge, then stepping back to allow more thoughts to gather. It's keeping the problem alive in your mind so that when inspiration strikes, you're ready to seize it. Original thinkers don't rush to closure because they know closure often suffocates creativity. In fact, studies on creativity confirm this. People who start a project early but leave it unfinished tend to come up with more novel ideas than those who finish everything at once. The act of leaving something undone creates what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect. It means our brains have a natural tendency to return to incomplete tasks, to keep turning them over, to keep connecting the dots even when we're not consciously focused on them. This constant background processing is where originality finds oxygen. Procrastination, when intentional, isn't avoidance, it's incubation. But here's the surprising twist. Original thinkers often don't look confident while doing this. From the outside, they might seem scattered, inconsistent, or even careless. They're the ones scribbling on napkins, starting drafts they never finish, letting projects sit half-completed for weeks. To others, it may look like they're not committed. But in reality, this messy process is their genius at work. By refusing to settle too soon, they keep the door open for better solutions, sharper insights, and more imaginative possibilities. The beauty of this habit is that it teaches us a different relationship with time. Most of us treat deadlines as cages. You're either inside them or you're failing. Original thinkers treat deadlines as a rhythm. They push just enough to ensure they'll deliver, but they resist the temptation to arrive too early. They linger in that uncomfortable but fertile space between starting and finishing, and in that space their best ideas are born. This doesn't mean procrastination always feels good. In fact, it's often uncomfortable. There's anxiety in knowing something is undone. There's tension in holding an open loop. But original thinkers don't run from that discomfort. They embrace it. They understand that the unease of waiting is the price of originality. Instead of treating it as a weakness to eliminate, they treat it as a tool to harness. And if we're honest, we've all experienced glimpses of this in our own lives. That last minute rush where you surprise yourself with what you create. That idea that comes not while staring at your desk, but while driving home, showering, or cooking dinner. Those flashes of insight don't appear when we force them. They appear when we give them time. Original thinkers have simply learned to trust that process. They lean into the delay. They make procrastination part of their creative rhythm. One of the most surprising habits of original thinkers is how many bad ideas they produce. We often imagine that great innovators, artists, or entrepreneurs somehow wake up with brilliance flowing naturally through them, as if they skip the messy part of creativity. But the truth is, originality doesn't come from having only good ideas. It comes from having a lot of ideas, most of which are bad, impractical, or even ridiculous. The willingness to generate in volume is what makes the few brilliant ideas possible. Think about how we're trained to view ideas in most systems. In school, we're rewarded for having the right answer, not for exploring dozens of wrong ones. At work, we're encouraged to share the polished solution, not the half-baked thoughts that may sound silly at first. Because of this, most people become afraid of being wrong. They silence themselves before they even speak, editing their creativity into submission before it can breathe. Original thinkers resist this. They are not afraid of looking foolish. They know that the first, second, even the 10th idea might be weak. But they also know that hidden inside that pile of mediocrity lies the seed of something extraordinary. Take Thomas Edison as an example. He didn't just invent the light bulb in a single stroke of genius. He tested thousands of different materials for the filament, thousands of failed attempts before finding the one that worked. To the world, he is remembered for a brilliant invention, but behind that brilliance were more failed ideas than most people would ever be willing to endure. That's the paradox of originality. The price of one world-changing idea is often thousands of unsuccessful ones. And this pattern isn't limited to science. In music, Picasso created over 20 works of art in his lifetime. Most of them never became famous, and many weren't considered masterpieces. But without the endless production, the experimentation, the willingness to try again and again, the world would never have received the works that transformed art forever. Original thinkers don't expect every idea to succeed. They expect to fail often. What sets them apart is their ability to keep creating despite the failures. There's something liberating in this habit. It reminds us that creativity is not about perfection. It's about permission. Permission to explore, to test, to make mistakes, and to learn. Original thinkers give themselves that permission. They lower the stakes of each individual idea so that they can play with possibilities. By doing so, they increase their chances of stumbling onto something remarkable. If you only ever allow yourself to produce what you think is good, you dramatically shrink the odds of producing anything great. Psychologists studying creativity have found that the sheer number of ideas someone generates directly increases the odds of originality. Quantity breeds quality. It's a numbers game. Yet most people avoid playing that game because they're too concerned about how their bad ideas will be judged. Original thinkers flip this. They know their bad ideas aren't wasted effort. They're stepping stones. Each bad idea refines the path, teaches a lesson, or sparks a new direction. Another important element is how original thinkers treat those bad ideas. They don't dismiss them with shame or embarrassment. They collect them. They jot them down, revisit them later, and sometimes discover that what seemed impossible one day becomes practical when the world changes. An idea that doesn't work today may work tomorrow, and the only way to have that option is to have generated it in the first place. Their notebooks, sketches, and scraps of paper are filled with concepts that might look meaningless to others, but they represent a reservoir of raw material waiting for the right moment. It's worth noticing, too, that this habit requires courage. It takes courage to voice an idea you know might fail. It takes courage to share something that could be laughed at or ignored, but original thinkers would rather risk being wrong than risk saying nothing. They don't let fear silence them, because they know silence kills originality faster than any mistake ever could. The world never sees the majority of their failures, but without those failures, the world would never see their breakthroughs either. This habit also reveals an important truth about originality. It's messy. It's not a straight line from problem to solution. It's a winding road filled with detours, dead ends, and backtracking. Original thinkers embrace that mess. They don't try to clean it up too soon. They live in it, trusting that clarity will eventually emerge from the chaos. That's why they often appear restless or scattered, constantly chasing new angles, experimenting with odd ideas, or asking strange questions. To the outside observer, it may look inefficient, but to them, it's the only path to originality. Consider how this applies in everyday life. When a group sits down to brainstorm, most people hold back, waiting for the safe answer. Original thinkers are the ones who throw wild suggestions into the room. Maybe 9 out of 10 don't work, but the 10th opens a door no one else saw. The willingness to risk those 9 failures is what makes that one success possible. And the irony is, the people who appear to waste time with bad ideas are often the ones who save the group from settling for mediocrity. Even technology companies, some of the most innovative organizations in the world, operate on this principle. They launch products that flop, apps that no one downloads, features that users reject. But instead of hiding those failures, they learn from them and iterate. Google has killed off dozens of products, but those experiments were not wasted. They paved the way for the successes that shaped the digital world. The culture of trying, failing, and trying again is what keeps them original. This habit of producing bad ideas also changes how original thinkers experience failure. They don't view it as a final judgment. They view it as feedback. A failed idea isn't proof they're not creative. It's proof they're creating. It shows they're in the arena, testing, stretching, pushing the boundaries. Failure is not a stop sign. For them, it's a signpost pointing toward what to try next. And because they generate so many ideas, failure doesn't define them. It's just one data point in a much larger journey. One of the most defining habits of original thinkers is their willingness to doubt the default. Most people move through life accepting the way things are. We assume that the systems we live in, the processes we follow, and the traditions we inherit exist because they are the best options. We rarely pause to ask whether the default makes sense or whether it still serves us. Original thinkers approach the world differently. They don't take reality at face value. They see defaults not as rules to follow but as assumptions to test. This doesn't mean they are rebels for the sake of rebellion. It's not about rejecting everything just to stand out. Doubting the default is not cynicism, it's curiosity. It's the quiet question, why do we do it this way? That simple question opens doors most people never notice. When everyone else assumes the answer is final, original thinkers assume the answer is only the beginning. Consider how much of our lives is governed by defaults. The structure of a school day, the layout of a city, the way we communicate, even the apps on our phones. All of these are designed by someone at some point, and then accepted by millions without question. But every one of those defaults was a choice, and if it was a choice once, it can be a choice again. Original thinkers never forget this. They remind us that behind every system is a decision, and behind every decision is the possibility of change. This habit explains why many breakthroughs sound strange or impractical at first. When Airbnb began, the default assumption was that strangers don't stay in other people's homes. Hotels were the norm, and the idea of renting out an air mattress in a living room felt absurd. But the founders questioned the default. They asked why not? Why couldn't people trust each other enough to share their homes? Today, that question reshaped an entire industry. The same is true with companies like Tesla. The default for decades was that cars run on gasoline. Electric vehicles were dismissed as weak, slow, and impractical. But by doubting that default, Tesla pushed forward a movement that has now become a cornerstone of the future of transportation. These shifts didn't come from blindly accepting what was given. They came from daring to ask, what if the default is wrong? What makes this habit powerful is not just the ability to challenge the obvious, but the courage to sit with the uncertainty that follows. When you doubt the default, you step outside of the comfortable path. You enter a space where there are no guarantees, no proven formulas. That's uncomfortable for most people. But original thinkers are willing to live in that discomfort because they understand that the biggest opportunities exist outside the safety of what everyone else accepts. In our daily lives, doubting the default doesn't always mean starting a company or revolutionizing an industry. It can be as simple as questioning the routine you follow without thinking. Why do you check your email first thing in the morning? Why do you measure success by comparison to others? Why do you believe productivity requires long hours instead of focused hours? Each of these defaults shapes how we work, think, and live. When we stop to question them, we create space for new possibilities. History shows that progress is built on this habit. The abolition of slavery, the fight for women's rights, the invention of the printing press, all of these began with someone questioning what others assumed was permanent. The default was so ingrained that it felt untouchable, but original thinkers are not intimidated by what feels untouchable. They understand that even the strongest traditions are still human creations, and therefore they can be reimagined. There's also a psychological element to doubting the default. Most people experience what psychologists call status quo bias. We prefer the familiar over the unfamiliar, even if the familiar is not the best option. This bias convinces us that change is risky and sticking with the current system is safer. Original thinkers don't escape this bias entirely. but they manage it differently. Instead of letting the status quo bias control them, they use curiosity to interrupt it. Their natural instinct is to ask, what am I not seeing? What assumptions am I making? What if there's another way? That questioning breaks the spell of the default and allows them to see options others miss. Interestingly, doubting the default is not always about grand innovation. Sometimes it's about small but meaningful shifts. Take a writer who questions the default structure of a story, or a teacher who questions the default way of teaching a subject. These small acts of doubt can lead to fresh approaches that transform the experience for others. Original thinkers don't measure the worth of questioning by its scale. They measure it by its impact. Even the smallest shift can spark originality if it challenges a default that no one else bothered to notice. What's striking about this habit is that it doesn't always make original thinkers comfortable to be around. When someone questions the default in a meeting, they can come across as disruptive. When a child questions why rules exist, adults sometimes dismiss them as difficult. But disruption is not the goal, it's a byproduct. The true goal is exploration. The willingness to keep asking why ensures that the world doesn't stagnate under the weight of unquestioned assumptions. In many ways, doubting the default is less about intelligence and more about perspective. It's not about knowing the right answer, it's about realizing the answer isn't fixed. That mindset alone sets original thinkers apart. Where others see a wall, they see a door that hasn't been opened yet. Where others see a rule, they see an option someone once chose and might choose differently again. This habit requires resilience too, because questioning the default often invites criticism. People don't like having their assumptions challenged. It makes them defensive, sometimes even hostile. Original thinkers learn to navigate that resistance. They understand that doubt doesn't always lead to immediate acceptance, but they don't stop asking. They trust that the act of questioning itself is valuable, even if the world isn't ready for the answer yet. One of the hardest truths about originality is that it doesn't wait for permission. Original thinkers know that if they wait until they feel fully prepared, they will never begin. Readiness is an illusion. Confidence doesn't come before action. It comes after. This is why original thinkers have a habit of starting before they feel ready. They step into uncertainty, they launch ideas that aren't fully formed, and they take action even when doubt lingers in the back of their minds. Most people believe they need certainty before taking a leap. We tell ourselves we'll write that book once we've mastered the craft, start that business once the plan is perfect, or share that idea once we're sure it won't be criticized, but those conditions never arrive. There's always another reason to delay, another gap in knowledge, another fear whispering in our ear. Original thinkers don't eliminate those doubts, they simply move anyway. They know that the act of starting creates the clarity they were waiting for. History is filled with stories of people who began long before they felt ready. The Wright brothers didn't have advanced degrees in engineering. They were bicycle mechanics. On paper, they were unqualified to change the future of aviation. But they didn't wait for credentials or perfect conditions. They started experimenting, building, failing, and rebuilding. Through that messy process, they taught themselves what no textbook could teach. Their courage to begin without readiness gave humanity the gift of flight. This same principle applies to entrepreneurs, artists, and leaders across time. Think of writers who begin with messy first drafts. They don't wait until the words come out perfectly. They put something down on paper and let the process refine it later. Musicians write songs that never get released, not because they were wasted, but because they were stepping stones toward the ones that eventually moved the world. Readiness didn't arrive at the beginning, it arrived along the way. Starting before feeling ready is also an act of humility. It's an acknowledgement that you don't know everything, and that's okay. Many people avoid starting because they think their ignorance disqualifies them. Original thinkers see it differently. They view ignorance as an asset because it forces them to learn, to ask questions others overlook, and to stay curious. When you begin without all the answers, you're more open to discovering new ones. The pursuit itself becomes the teacher. There's also a psychological shift that happens when you act before you feel ready. The moment you take the first step, fear begins to lose its grip. Action creates momentum, and momentum builds confidence. You don't become ready by waiting, you become ready by doing. Original thinkers seem fearless, but they're not. They feel the same hesitation everyone else feels. The difference is that they refuse to let readiness be the gatekeeper of their creativity. This habit also explains why original thinkers are often misunderstood at first. When they launch an idea that isn't polished, others may dismiss it as naive or premature. But originality rarely looks perfect in the beginning. It looks rough, unproven, and sometimes even foolish. The first personal computers were clunky, slow, and expensive. The first versions of great companies were often chaotic and unstable. Yet, without those imperfect beginnings, there would be no refined products, no mature organizations, no revolutions. Starting before being ready means being willing to look foolish temporarily in order to grow into something extraordinary. It also means being willing to fail publicly. Many people are terrified of embarrassment, so they wait until they can guarantee success before they act. Original thinkers know that guarantee never comes. They embrace the possibility of failing in front of others because they understand that failure is not the end, it's the tuition you pay for progress. Every attempt that doesn't work is an investment in the next one that will. If they waited for certainty, they'd never pay that price, and they'd never reap the reward. On a practical level, starting before you feel ready allows you to adapt to reality instead of clinging to theory. Plans are safe on paper, but the moment they meet the real world, they change. Markets shift, circumstances evolve, unexpected challenges appear. The only way to navigate those changes is by being in motion. Original thinkers don't spend endless hours trying to predict every possible outcome before they begin. They start, observe, learn, and adjust. Readiness is replaced by resilience. This approach to action also reveals something about how original thinkers define success. For them, success is not about being flawless from the start. It's about progress. It's about moving from 0 to 1, from idea to attempt, from hesitation to momentum. Each small step forward is valuable, not because it proves readiness, but because it proves willingness. They measure themselves not by how much they knew at the start, but by how much they grew along the way. It's easy to look at the finished products of originality, successful companies, masterpieces of art, world-changing inventions, and assume they were born from confidence and certainty. But if you peel back the layers, you always find beginnings that were uncertain, messy, and unpolished. Original thinkers don't hide from that, they embrace it. They know that the courage to begin without readiness is what separates those who dream from those who do. This habit also extends beyond grand projects into daily life. It shows up when someone speaks up in a meeting before their idea is fully formed. It shows up when a parent tries a new approach with their child, unsure if it will work but willing to experiment. It shows up when a student raises their hand with a question, even if they're afraid it might sound obvious. Each of these moments reflects the same principle. Readiness is not the requirement for action. Action is the requirement for readiness, and perhaps the most surprising thing about this habit, it is how it redefines confidence itself. We tend to think confidence is something you need before starting. But original thinkers prove the opposite. Confidence is built through the act of starting, through the courage of being unready, through the willingness to take the first step without knowing where the last step will lead. There's a common misconception that original thinkers are fearless. People look at the inventors, the visionaries, the leaders who change the course of history and assume they must have been immune to doubt, untouched by fear. But the truth is very different. Original thinkers feel the same fear of failure that everyone else does. The difference lies in how they respond to that fear. They don't wait for the fear to disappear because it never fully does. Instead, they act anyway. They choose movement over paralysis, progress over perfection, courage over comfort. Fear of failure is one of the most powerful forces that shapes human behavior. It's the voice that whispers, "What if you're not good enough? What if you embarrass yourself? What if you lose everything?" That voice is persuasive, and for most people, it's enough to keep them playing small, staying safe, and avoiding risk. Original thinkers hear that same voice, but they interpret it differently. For them, fear is not a stop sign. It's a signal that they are standing at the edge of something that matters. Fear tells them they are pushing against the boundaries of the familiar, and that's exactly where originality begins. Consider the story of J.K. Rowling. Before she became the celebrated author of one of the most successful book series in history, she was rejected by multiple publishers. Each rejection could have been final. Each one could have convinced her to stop writing, to believe she wasn't good enough. She felt the sting of failure deeply, but she didn't let it define her. She acted anyway, submitting again, writing again, and holding on to the vision she believed in. Her story isn't one of fearlessness. It's one of persistence in the face of fear. This pattern repeats throughout history. When Nelson Mandela stood against apartheid, he knew the risks were enormous. He spent years in prison, separated from his family, enduring hardships that would break most people. The fear of failure was real, the possibility of defeat constant, but he acted anyway, and his courage changed the fate of a nation. Original thinkers don't deny fear. They carry it with them as they act, refusing to let it dictate their choices. At the core of this habit is a shift in perspective about what failure means. Most people see failure as an identity. It says something about who they are. Original thinkers see failure as information. It says something about what they tried. That small shift makes all the difference. When failure is information, it becomes something to learn from rather than something to run from. Every misstep adds clarity. Every setback sharpens strategy. Fear still hurts, but it doesn't paralyze because it doesn't carry the weight of defining who they are. There's also a paradox here. Original thinkers often fear failure more deeply than others because their ideas matter so much to them. They care intensely about what they are creating, and that care makes the possibility of failure sting more. But that same intensity gives them the fuel to keep going. Fear of failure coexists with a greater fear, the fear of regret. They would rather fail trying than live with the regret of never knowing what could have been. That trade-off drives them forward. In everyday life, this habit shows up in small but significant ways. A student raises their hand with an answer they're not sure is correct. An employee pitches a new idea, knowing it might be rejected. A parent tries a new approach with their child, risking it may not work. These aren't headline-making acts, but they reflect the same principle. Fear doesn't disappear, but action still happens. Original thinkers accumulate dozens of these small acts of courage, and over time, those small acts compound into originality. Fear of failure also acts as a kind of compass. It points toward the things that matter most. If something scares you, it's usually because it touches your values, your ambitions, or your identity. Original thinkers use that fear as a guide. Instead of avoiding it, they lean into it. They ask themselves, what is this fear protecting me from? And is that protection worth the cost of never trying? More often than not, they decide it's not, so they step forward, trembling but determined. This is why originality so often looks like bravery from the outside. We see the bold moves, the daring choices, the groundbreaking ideas, and we assume the person behind them must have been fearless. But bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. Original thinkers embody this truth in everything they do. Their originality doesn't come from being fearless, it comes from being unwilling to let fear make their decisions for them. Failure itself becomes part of their identity, not as a source of shame, but as proof of effort. Every failure is evidence that they dared, that they stepped outside the comfort zone where most people remain. They carry the scars of failure proudly because those scars are also the markers of growth. Each failure is a chapter in the story of how they became who they are. It's important to note that this habit doesn't make the experience of fear easier. Acting in spite of fear doesn't erase the sleepless nights, the racing heart, or the knot in the stomach. Original thinkers feel all of it. What changes is the meaning they assign to it. To them, fear is a sign of significance. It means the path ahead is worth walking. It means they are doing something that has the potential to make a difference. So they act, not because they are fearless, but because the possibility of impact outweighs the certainty of fear. This is why the work of original thinkers so often resonates with others. People see themselves in the struggle, in the vulnerability, in the courage to act without guarantees. Their stories remind us that fear is universal, but so is the capacity to act. Original thinkers don't silence fear, they carry it with them as they step into the unknown, showing us that fear and action can coexist. The surprising habits of original thinkers reveal a truth that challenges how most of us view creativity and success. They show us that originality is not a gift reserved for the fearless, the brilliant, or the chosen few. It is a practice, a series of habits that anyone can cultivate. They procrastinate not because they are lazy, but because they allow ideas to breathe and evolve. They produce countless bad ideas, understanding that failure is not a waste, but the soil from which greatness grows. They question the defaults that most people accept, daring to ask why and refusing to settle for what has always been. They begin before they feel ready, trusting that clarity comes from movement, not from waiting. And even though they fear failure just as much as anyone else, they act anyway, proving that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving despite it. When we look closely, originality isn't about being extraordinary from the start. It's about embracing the messy, imperfect, and uncertain process of bringing something new into the world. It's about daring to think differently, to try boldly, to risk failure, and to keep going even when the outcome is unknown. The habits of original thinkers remind us that each of us has the capacity to create, to lead, and to shape the future. The only question is whether we are willing to step into that possibility.